mentioned a new book. That's the Complete B Handbook, and this is designed to be a book for like the grandkids, for other members of family that don't understand what you're doing, for gardeners, people that like honey and the other products and ways to try to use them. Has a bit of history too, a bit of background in terms of where bees came from, and of course some information on how we handle them. It's not a book that is beekeeping. That's the honeybee biology and beekeeping. That was developed as a textbook, and it's used in about 30 different universities across U.S., Canada, and a couple in England. A couple others you might be interested in. I do have an Africanized bee book, and also they have the author of the Penn State manual on the field guide to honeybees and their maladies. You can get those from me, or all of them are available on Amazon. Um, so that's the commercial. So now we can go commercial free. All right.
Mhm.
I will mention, as Jerry indicated, that I'm the principal author of the Honeybee Health Coalition Tools for Varroa Management. This is a tool that you really do need for the entire year. It talks about the various methods, chemical and non-chemical methods, in terms of working with Varroa, from the sampling onto the various compounds and alternative methods to try to reduce the mite numbers in colonies. And for a number of the aspects, we also have this as video series. So they're embedded in the tools. We continually update this. As you might well be aware, Formic has a relatively new product. Many people starting to use it this year, the Formic Pro. And the HopGuard product is a new one this year, HopGuard 3, a bit of an improvement from 2 in that it has a much longer life. The Formic Pro big difference is that that 2 has a longer shelf life, and it has a more beekeeper friendly method in terms of application of that material. So we try to keep this up to date with information. Jerry said he wasn't sure what BMPs were. We also have another in this series, and that's best management practices. So that's looking at everything from where you site your colonies, how you handle them, your PPE, personal protective equipment, handling honey, etc. With some look in terms of uh, you know, what are some of the things you might do to improve overwintering survival, but also to be a friendly neighborhood beekeeper as well. So that's tools for varroa management and best management practices. If you simply use your search engine and look up Honeybee Health Coalition, it's a .org. And then you'll quickly be led to Varroa, or you want to slash forward Varroa, you'll get there, same place. All righty, from downtown Marin County, couple of ways that we used to keep bees in skeps, and a few people in a few places still do. And of course, some people keep bees in structures that are not a removable frame. I'm not going to talk really much about that tonight. I'm going to talk more about movable frame beekeeping. Uh, we're going to talk a little bit about those nasty, nasty varroa mites. Uh, it is, of course, not the mites, it's their spreading of DWV, VDV, CBPV. Don't we love our acronyms? Those are various viruses. These are viruses that reach epidemic proportions very quickly. The bees have viruses, they have lots of viruses, but somehow bees feeding on the bee's body and feeding particularly on the pupae help these viruses in their struggle to overcome other viruses, and these are the ones that cause the sudden collapse, the epidemics of one single virus that then the whole colony collapses fairly quickly. Talk a little bit about the concept of taking losses in the fall. Now, I recognize that you do not have much of a winter there, but um, in many places where there is, it's if we go back to Langstroth, he was one of the early ones that recommended taking losses in the fall. And I'll make the same concept of, we often have dinky colonies, colonies that just aren't doing anything and aren't going to do anything. And a lot of our management time is spent on them. And we end up with a slightly bigger colony that's still a dinky colony that still isn't going anywhere. So I'm going to emphasize a little bit, maybe some other ways to look at those rather than wasting our time on those, help get them back productive if that's our objectives. Obviously, we got to talk about stores, the system, the honey, it runs this whole system. We're always asking the question, does this colony have enough? Are they going to, not succumb to starvation in the spring, or as we're going now into a time that's for many of us a little bit less productive? Is there enough honey? Are they going to get through? And so we're talking often about supplementing, and one of the supplements that commercials do is the high fructose corn syrup. It's not a sugar; it's made from corn. Uh, when this is stored improperly, this can build up a toxic sugar, which is not, of course, very useful. Um, we'll also talk about sugar syrup and whether it should be heavy or light, et cetera, and of course, feeding of honey. We have colonies that have diseases, and so our acronyms kick in again: AFB, EFB, IBDS. IBDS is another of these diseases, and we see it now this time of year in our colonies. It's a syndrome, so the S stands for syndrome. Uh, D obviously for disease, B for brood. But the key to understanding this and our understanding of it is the first letter I. I is for idiosyncratic brood disease syndrome. That's a lot, four big, dime words that mean we don't know what in the hell's going on. Can't tell. Don't know what it is. IBDS, idiosyncratic brood disease syndrome. We haven't the faintest, but we do see it, and we particularly see it this time of year. I guess one of the ways to look at colonies, if we want to get it down to its basics, is look at the 3 M's. The 3 M's are mites, munchies, and moisture. And if we are good at being able to look at the colony and assess those 3 factors, and doing something about those 3 factors if it is warranted, and determining when it might be warranted, we'll be way ahead in our management. So it comes down to the 3 M's. So I mentioned in the outline all these different acronyms. So the last one is LOL, and that's what we need with our bee colonies. We need lots of luck. Lots of luck. All right. So we could start in any number of places talking about this time of year. It's become much more common and popular these days to look at what do the bees do? Whoa, what a concept. What's the natural behavior? What are the bees doing? So we go to where they live, sides of buildings, but bee trees, perhaps a little bit more their natural habitat where there were trees. Where there weren't trees, then they were in those skeps, or they were in clay cylinders or pots, ceramic pots of one sort. So this time of year for most areas, what happens in those trees? Well, they are reducing population, and they're trying to conserve resources, because even though you do not have much that we can call winter, it is a period when they are not resource rich at this time. So they needed to conserve some of that. And a natural condition when they are not very flush with resources is to reduce their size. They can work just as well with a smaller number. They will tighten that brood sphere up so that when those nights get a little bit cooler, they can cluster. And cooler here means that nighttime temperature is going down roughly below 50. They really start clustering around 50. They're good, fairly good, decent ball-shaped clusters 45 or below. This is the degrees Fahrenheit. So 10 degrees, 6 to 10 degrees, they're forming clusters, but below 6, below roughly 45, they're really into their tighter cluster. And this is accomplished by the queen reducing her egg laying. She doesn't do this voluntarily. The control for egg laying is the workers. They're the real control. The queen does not control. She lays the eggs, obviously, but except when we get a laying worker condition. But it's the workers that are controlling all this. Colonies get rid of the surplus baggage, and that means the males, the drones, and so they'll discharge the drones. They won't try to carry them through. And we can sometimes tell a colony is not in the shape it should be because they're not doing that. They're not getting rid of the drones. Queenless colonies, for example, will not do a good job, or colonies still replacing their queens will not go ahead and get rid of drones. And then they need to the bees need to suspend the aging process. And the way they do that is they start storing more body material. Something like a hibernation of an animal, such as a bear will do, and the bees do something of the same thing. And they need two types of resources. They need honey to fuel the system, and they need within their own body the stores that will then help them sustain for. Instead of living 5 to 6 weeks, they'll live in northern climates 5 to 6 months, for example, during the winter. And they can do that because there's less activity, but there are also more food reserves within their own individual bodies. They don't necessarily have to have that hit that day of honey, because if they don't, they still have enough reserves to get through to the next day or a day after, when they can get the honey and refuel. Let me start with just a very brief discussion on losses. You're well aware that we've been measuring losses. This is the record of the Bee Informed group, now out of the University of Maryland. Back in 2007, 2006, we started by asking commercial beekeepers how about their overwinter losses. We also asked them what could they accept as a reasonable, acceptable amount. And the acceptable level was at the 15% level, but we found that they were having over 30% level of losses. We then expanded that survey to include backyarders and made it electronic in 2011, the spring of 2011. We still asked that question, how many did you lose over the winter period? But then we also asked the question, how many did you lose over the annual through the whole year, by asking how many of the summer losses did you have? So the gray is the winter losses, the light yellow, the summer losses, and the darker oranges is pumpkin color, appropriate for the season, was annual losses. So carrying that fast forward to our last overwintering survey, we found that we had, when we asked the query of all 50 states, 10% of the beekeepers in the US, they had 22% overwinter losses. And notice how this is about half of the winter losses of the year before. So we went from the very heaviest winter losses we've ever had in over a dozen years to the second lowest winter losses that we've had. But if you've seen the headlines, and increasingly the headlines, you'll see that it was a terrible year. Beekeepers, US beekeepers, all 50 states lost about half their colonies through the year. So this is that goldenrod to look at here. This is our annual loss. And you can see there was only one other year back here when we had heavier losses. So last winter, second lowest overwintering losses, but the second highest over total annual losses. Well, when I came to Oregon 10 years ago, in between seeing the grandkids and really enjoying them, my oldest now, the two families, the two oldest are now in high school kids, so they've grown somehow. I don't know how that happened. But when I did, I came and I've continued the bee work. And one of the things I've continued is a bee survey of the Pacific Northwest. So this is looking, I partition the backyards in a different survey than we partition the commercial, semi-commercial. So the red trace up above here is for the last 10 years, the loss of the total loss of colonies for backyarders. You can see this past year that was at 38%. Now the blue trace here is of the larger scale. Semi-commercial, by definition, I'm using a definition that developed by many years ago. Semi-commercial is 50 to 500 colonies, commercial 500. You can't make your entire living from 500 colonies, but at one time you certainly could, but we're still using that definition. So the blue traces of those, and you can see there's no overlap at all. Our backyard beekeepers, by and large, lose about twice the number of colonies that the commercial beekeepers lose. It's still higher than what they are saying as an acceptable level, but it is less. And so you can see last year for the 3 Pacific Northwest states, so this is Oregon, Washington, and the state of Idaho, 21% loss for the commercials. And you can see they really trace right along. So when we have a bad season and we have heavy losses like the year before, both the backyarders, 48%, and the commercials in the Pacific Northwest, 35% loss as well. Now, that seems like a roller coaster. One of the things the surveys of the Be Informed and my Pacific Northwest survey don't answer is the why. We're saying what's happening, what's the numbers, but the surveys are not saying why. We have some suggestions from the questions we asked from management, and that's a couple things I'll cover. Now, I've added a third trace on this one in that the Be Informed survey is a national survey, and so it also asked the beekeepers in Oregon and California, all 50 states, of their losses. Notice what the similarity is here. So the orange trace, this one up above, is the backyarders, okay? Their annual losses for the last 10 years. The blue line is the red line is the loss of our Oregon commercial beekeepers for the last 10 years. And the blue line is what Be Informed says those Oregon participants or those that have bees in Oregon has been for the last 10 years. Notice the Be Informed is not saying what's happening in our backyards. It's not telling us what's happening to our beekeepers that have fewer than 50 colonies. It is strictly measuring, because of the way we're reporting it, the loss of the number of colonies by beekeepers in the state or have colonies for part of the year in the state. And so we have 95% of the respondents to our electronic surveys are backyarders and have their 1 to 50 colonies. But the number of colonies are from those 100 and 110, 115 commercial beekeepers. And so this is really, the Be Informed is really an expression of the commercial. But keep in mind that our backyarders are roughly double the level of losses. And most of the Alameda beekeepers, the county beekeepers, are backyarders, as with most of our associations here in Oregon as well. Now, if you go on to the Be Informed, you will see those numbers for California. So let me show you the last 3 numbers. So this past year, California beekeepers had a 21% loss. The year before, 31% loss. Year before that, 26. So if I had plotted those, it would be 21% right here, 31% up here, and then 26 right here. So that would look very much like our Oregon commercials. The Be Informed looks at anywhere from 115 to 144 beekeepers just in these last 3 years, and counts in California 237,000 plus or minus colonies. We know that that in California there are in excess of 500,000 colonies. So the record is pretty good for California, but that's also an anomaly in that if one of our Oregon beekeepers has bees in California, and virtually all the commercials do, they are counted in this number of colonies in California at the level of loss that they are reporting. So this number is, again, commercial beekeepers, and it's not just California commercial beekeepers. It's any beekeepers that have numbers. So in any of these surveys, I know some of the clubs are doing surveys, you got to look at what population we're talking about. Now, there's another way to look at this as well that's, I think, just as important. We'll get off graphs here pretty soon and on to some pretty pictures of bees. And that is gross versus net losses. So we hear about these terrible losses. Roughly half the colonies in the US were lost last year, according to the Bee Informed survey that sampled the owners of about 10% of the colonies across the US. But what does that represent? It really represents what we're losing on an annual basis, or what we can think of as a gross loss, an annual loss that occurs. Now, are we losing bee colonies in the United States? So is there a net loss of half of the colonies every year in the United States? Well, as beekeepers, we know that's the answer. We're actually not losing colonies in the United States. We have a net gain. This is a trace of National Agricultural Statistics Service, NAS, from 1939. The blue bars represent the number of estimated colonies. Now they're using an algorithm. They're using a different database. These are not volunteers. These are people that are getting some assistance or something of some way that they then query, and it's not voluntary. You have to give them the number. And then they're taking a subset from that. And so we estimate, we figure that the highest number of bee colonies we have ever had in the U.S. was just about the end of World War II. There were a lot of incentives during the war to be a beekeeper. Every farm had bees, etc. From that period until they stopped this statistical service in what's that number, say 81, we were losing about a colony per year. So from a very top of roughly 6 million colonies, they thought we were then down below 5 million. Due to a number of things that happened at this period of time, following the 1981, we had the introduction of tracheal mite in 1984, and then the biggie, varroa mites in 1987. There was a huge pressure for this service to, again, start estimating numbers of colonies. And so they did. They picked up a survey again. They started with a different way of counting. They eliminated everyone that wasn't producing honey, eliminated everyone that had 5 or fewer colonies, and had a different database, in part from census figures. And so it looks like there's a gap that we lost this amount from in that time. We actually did not. It's just a different way that the statistical service was counting. So from that period to the present, looking at numbers of colonies, again, that's the end of the blue bar, we were only losing half the number that we lost from the end of World War II to 81, roughly 4.3. Now, one other part on this is I've drawn a black box since 2006. Now, 2006 is a legend year in beekeeping, because a bunch of us sat at the American Beekeeping Federation and meeting in Austin, Texas, and started hearing about beekeepers that were having this most unique, most unusual, something they've never seen before, these losses that all of a sudden the colony collapsed. Well, we've seen that before. We've seen it on a limited basis, but not on beekeepers from Wisconsin, from Pennsylvania, from New York State, a couple from California were saying, I've never seen this before. I mean, my colonies just went from full colonies to nothing in a month's time. We coined a term at the time, which is the term CCD. So that's where that came from, of all of a sudden a number of beekeepers, a number of places saying their colonies just simply collapse. So colony collapse disorder. Well, since 2006 on this trace, you'll notice that we are actually gaining. We're actually gaining since 2006 about a colony per year. So we are having huge losses, such as last year, almost 1 in 2 colonies. But net wise in the US, we are not. We are actually increasing the colony numbers. And we're not unique. So here's the trace, the blue trace for the United States. Here's a trace for Canada. And here's the worldwide trace. And roughly the same amount. Well, the worldwide trace goes back to 61 here, 60. So from 60 up until the last year here of reliable numbers, FAO numbers, 2013, there was a net gain worldwide from roughly 50 million colonies up to 80 million colonies. Let me get rid of that black box. Quite a gain. All right. We have not gained as significantly here in the US, we are, or in Canada, and they are. So net wise, we're not losing. And so hearing terrible losses of 50% of the colonies lost in the United States over the year does not mean honeybees are going extinct. And although we find other bees and other pollinators also in some sort of a peril, although some species are going extinct, extinction is a natural process. We're not losing just huge numbers, and the process, the biological process of pollination, is not in danger. All right. Another way of looking at our losses is as a three-legged stool. So if we're going to balance our bee on top of the stool, we'll talk about diseases, pests, and nutrition. At this point, is there anything that's come in on the chat? I'm not sure who's monitoring chat, Jim or Jerry, anything?
I am not. I'm trying to keep up with the people coming in.
I understand that. Yeah.
So can Jerry or someone else keep an eye on the chat side and anything? Would you like to be interrupted if a question comes in, Dr. Caron?
Yeah, sure. Chime in when I take a breath, or right now, if someone has questions or something, wants to unmute, we can handle some before we jump into another section here.
There was nothing new on the chat rather.
Okay, Jerry. Anyone have a quick question?
I just have just a comment. Even though the numbers are, I'm a commercial beekeeper, so even though the numbers are, we're still increasing in hives. What the losses do to me is, I have a choice of building bees or making honey, and so when I have to make up losses, that means I have to shift more into the making bee side of the business versus making honey side, which is not as profitable for me. I make my money off of honey primarily, besides almonds. So there, yeah. I mean, there's even though the numbers look, we're keeping up, there is still a cost to it, and it's a pretty dramatic cost.
And it really is a dramatic cost. Yeah, because you just don't make them out of nothing. It's made out of something. However, there's another factor of course, at play, and that is about 3/4 of the honey that we consume in the United States is not produced here. It comes from somewhere else. And because honey is such a labor-intensive product to produce on a worldwide scale, globalization, that makes some sense. And that's why those worldwide numbers have dramatically increased from 50 to over 80 million. And that it's something that a cottage industry can develop. In some of the countries, socialist and the other countries with very heavy government control, often beekeeping flies underneath the radar. It's not something that's regulated. So we're dependent upon that import of honey, and as you're well aware, it's tough to make a living on honey because with our importing 3/4 of the product, it's not a market you can compete with for the industrial uses of honey. You've got to have an artisanal honey. You've got to have local markets that are willing to pay, $10, $12, $15 for a 1 pound jar of honey. You go to the supermarket, the big box store, and it's 8-ounce bear for $2.79. So that's not competitive at all. Any other comments or thoughts?
Do you think with the rise, I know that psychologically there was an effect on people. I know, talking to people when I was becoming a beekeeper, and it seemed as if that there was this desire for people to want to keep bees as a way of mitigating what they understood was colony collapse disorder. So I think that there was a thing that there was a kind of a Florence Nightingale thing among a lot of beekeepers who said, like, oh, I want to keep bees because there's bad things are happening to them. Let me keep bees to somehow help the situation out. Do you think that at least in the United States, was part of the maintaining the numbers of hives?
I do. Good point. I've been in this business since the 70s, and in the 70s and 80s and 90s, asking people why do they start bees to save the bees was never an answer. You never got that at all. And now it can be a fairly frequent answer.
Yeah.
But isn't it ironic? Isn't it ironic? The very people that want to save the bees are starting bee colonies to kill them.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah. Yep.
All righty. So let's. Everyone on here, of course, is not keeping bees to kill them. So let's go on and look at some aspects of what we could do in terms of those level of losses. And one of the skills we need to develop is, when we look at a colony, is that in the category of a weak colony or a strong colony? And I guess we could throw in a third category. Is it okay? Is it weak, okay, or strong? And I maintain, as I indicated earlier, that we spend an awful lot of time on those weak colonies, and we often end up with just a stronger weak colony, after we've done all those various aspects. But this is important to try to tell, because our management then is keyed in, is this a strong or is this a weak colony? One of the things we need to figure out, not only is it strong or okay or weak, but if it's weak, then why? Why is it weak? There can be any number of reasons, of course. We could probably list a dozen. I'm going to list 5. The colony swarmed, and so it divided by itself. Very good for mite control. We find natural colonies from bee trees do this all the time. They're in smaller cavities. They swarm all the time. And many of those bee trees don't have an issue with mites because they're controlling mites as well as their population size by swarming. Another reason could be they are divides, or those captures of the swarms that we put in. By very definition, we're taking a larger unit and making it into a weaker unit. We can do that skillfully, so the larger unit, hopefully, if we're dividing, the large unit stays large and does what we need it to do, pollinate crops or provide honey. And the divide then takes the pressure off from the colony itself swarming, and or gives us a way to make up those terrible loss numbers that we had from overwinter. So by definition, at least one part of that division of a strong colony is going to be a weaker colony. So those are our colonies that we would manage because they are weak, and we would manage them as weak colonies to try to get them to be strong. A third one can be if a colony had a queen event. And let me blow up this illustration that I had, so you might look at this. So this is queen events. So looking closely at this frame, you can see something is going on here. Now, this happens to be a British national. Their frames are squarish, so this is not a distorted slide. This is a squarish frame from the national hive. But what do you see? What in the world is going on here? Our eyes are immediately drawn to the brood area, and a little bit open.
Yeah.
Next is all the cells that have liquid in them, I think, for many of us.
Yeah.
That indicates maybe fall backfilling. They're pushing the queen out of that area. A little bit of honey stores in the corner where it should be. Not much in the way of pollen stores. Have you seen any of those things yet?
Just a little on the left.
Yeah, just almost no pollen. But what is really going on this frame? What's Action Central happening in Action Central, the brood area?
Supersedure like crazy.
Yeah, queen cells. They're raising a whole bunch of them in this case. They're raising, I think I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about a dozen queen cells. They're actually not supersedure cells because we have to look carefully. And if we look carefully, the base of the cell is a worker cell. Particularly look here on this one on the very top. Look at this one here within the brood area. You see the base is a worker cell. Now here's our cap cells, and here's a cap queen cell. Here's our cap queen cell. But the base of that cell was a worker cell, the horizontal worker cell. So this colony is going through a queen event where they lost their queen for whatever reason. Many times it's us, the beekeeper. So that's going to be a weak colony. They're going to be over a month before they're queen right again, 3 weeks to a month, because they're rearing their own queen. They're going to have to rear it. They're going to have to then have the fight of the queens and one virgin then prevail. She's going to take a few days before she can fly. She's going to take a few days to fly and mate. She's going to take a few days to then start egg laying. So adding up all those days, we're talking a good 3 weeks. Well, that's right out of the productive season. Now, how many weeks do we have in a productive season? And yet our colony, our precious little colony here is taking almost a whole month out of that time just to get back queen right. Okay. Maybe because we killed the queen or we took it away and put it in an observation hive, took it to the fair. The kids marveled at it, but our colony then had to rear a queen. So that's going to produce a weak colony. It's going to take, they've lost a month. They've got to catch that month up somehow in the season. Fourth issue here is a heavy mite infestation. We're going to see it as a spotty brood pattern. This is off in the red over on the side. We're actually going to see brood that is without its cappings. Some people call it ball brood, but we actually reserve that term for when wax moths take cappings off. It's cappings without cap cells without their cap. In other words, capless. We'll see snotty brood, this ugly looking brood that obviously is not healthy, that is not progressing. It's in the wrong position. It looks like, well, I hope you've all had your meal by now. That looks like a piece of snot in a cell. That's where that term comes from. In polite company, we can call that cruddy brood, okay? And we haven't brushed the bees off this frame, but look at how few adults we have on this frame. A lot of brood, but relatively few adults. The adults are dying off pretty dramatically. So all of this is our heavy mite infestation. This is what we're actually going to call PMS, or as we are wanting to relabel that these days, ADA-B, Parasitic Mite Brood Syndrome, because most of us see it in the brood. The spottiness, cappings that should be capped, cells that should be capped that are not, and then the bees chewing out. I'll take a little bit closer look of this for you. And you can see all of these cells over here. All of these should have cappings over them because they're pupae in the cells, but they don't. They don't because worker bees, the nurse age bees, are trying to get rid of the mite. Somehow they detected a mite in this cell, in this cell, in this cell. So they've taken the cappings off, or in the process of doing that. The mite runs out, but it totally interrupts her reproduction in the cell. And then in many cases, they don't recap them. They don't reapply the brood capping, but they actually throw out their developing pupa. A couple down here looks like they've been recapped. So you see this one has a slightly darker capping all in the middle of it. They do recap some of them, some down here, but many of them, they throw out that developing pupa. So you get this, you get a whole bunch of empty cells. So that's where your spotty pattern comes from. So that's your PMBS, the disruption, and it's strictly due to mites, but the action of bees trying to right the ship, trying to get back to a healthy stage by cutting down on mite reproduction within the cell. So it's bees trying to cure themselves, but obviously this is going to set the colony back. And heavy mite infestations set them back considerably. And then, of course, in heavy mite infestations, often then the virus, one of those harmful viruses take over, and then the whole colony collapses. Another one may be disease. In the spring, European foul brood can be fairly common. We don't know what's going on with European foul brood because it seems to become a little bit common more recently. Sort of comes in waves. Back in the 70s, I had a student that looked at European foul brood. We thought a large amount of it was due to nutrition. We measured some things, and now we're reinventing the wheel. We're thinking that EFB is a deficiency in nutrition in some way or other. It can happen in certain crops, such as blueberry. That's one of the very famous ones. That's the one we were looking back at back in the 70s. But there are others as well. Cranberry is one of those that does it as well. Almond, thankfully, is not one. But cucurbits, another one. All of these are pollens that don't offer very much for bees, kind of deficient in a number of the amino acids that they need. So, they're just not very nutritionally adequate. They have the wrong level of cholesterol. Bees can't make cholesterol. They have to get it in their diet. So, EFB, it appears in the spring. We also call it a stress disease when the colony is stressed. Imbalance of the adults, a lot of brood from a prolific queen, too few bees to take care of it, not enough forager bees because they've died out over the winter, et cetera, et cetera. And hopefully not disease of American foul brood. So take a little bit closer look. And looking for the diseases, it gets complicated right away with this PMBS. But looking strictly for the diseases, we're looking for the brood diseases of European foul brood, sac brood, and chalk brood. We look at open cells. So here are some cap cells. We're not interested in those and looking at them for European. We look at these open cells and we see some things such as right here in the middle, a larva that's in the wrong place. I mean, curled, coiled in the cell. It ought to be nice and C-shaped and right in the bottom so the bees can feed it easily. Something's wrong here. The one next to it, it's kind of got a little yellowish color to it. You can see the tracheal lines. The one on this side, sort of dehydrating. Instead of being all over the cell, it's fallen to the bottom. This will come right out with a sharp stick or forceps. We can see some other yellows up here at the top under the A, stretching all the way down to the bottom, almost below it. Another very yellowish. One all the way over here on the very side, a more pronounced yellowish. That's how we look for European foul brood. This is a cell of European foul brood, a great photo by Rob Snyder, who's up in the queen rearing area. He works for the Bee Informed Tech teams, a great photographer. Now, when we're looking for AFB, the more serious of the two, we don't worry about the larva. We got to look at cap cells because the AFB pathogen kills after the cell is capped. It kills in the prepupa or the pupal stage. So now we're concentrating on what the cap cells look like, and we see cells that have we have cells that have, come on, back. We'll get back there. Sorry about that. That look sunken, kind of look watery or greasy looking, and particularly perforations. Here's one here. Here's a bigger one here. Here's a larger perforation. Here, most of the capping has been taken off. About half the capping taken off here. What it is sort of, washing the windows in our house, washing the car, spring. So we make a little bit of effort of it, and then something distracts us and we get sidetracked. And so too with the bees. This is nasty stuff. It smells terrible to the bees as well as to ourselves. it's almost impossible to remove the dehydrating remains. And so what the bees do is they poke a hole in it and confirm, yep, that smells bad. Yep, I'm going to find something else to do right away. Let another bee come along and start the cleanup process. And so that's what these reflect. They've detected that there's disease in those cells, but they're too busy that day to go ahead and start the cleanup job, because it is quite a cleanup job. Because here's one where most of the capping has been taken off, and we're peering into the cell, and that's what we're seeing, and that's what the bee is seeing and smelling. They stick their mouth parts into this to try to take it up, and it's gooey and it's gummy. It doesn't remove. It starts dehydrating until it finally just curls right down into a very tough scale on this lower cell surface. It's nasty. It's, you just want to leave it to someone else to do the cleanup. So that's what how we would look for American foul brood with the cap cells. Look for these characteristics: coffee au lait, caramel color, with European foul brood, European open cells, in a yellowish color. So that's how we would take a look and try to see if we're looking at cells that have more that are weak, because they're just not hatching as much brood. It looks like a healthy cell right here and a healthy cell here. And undoubtedly under some of these cappings, there are some healthy cells, but you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 8 cells in just this little patch that we're seeing that are dying, that are not going to produce a replacement sister, because their young are dying from the pathogen of foul brood. So another reason for weak colony. So we've outlined 5, plenty of good reasons, and we could do some more. So let's get on to taking care of this, handling them. So how might we handle weaker colonies? Many of us as backyard beekeepers are not after honey. We want a little bit maybe, but we don't want a lot of honey. So it's okay. Weak colonies are okay. We can keep them in a single box. As long as they have 2 frames of honey, they're going to survive. They're going to do okay. You don't have a serious winter there in coastal California. Single boxes. As long as they've got a couple frames of honey. We even overwinter 5-frame nukes, as long as the outer 2 frames of the 5 are with honey. We can handle them by requeening them. They'll get strong eventually. The issue is that are we proactive? In other words, we could let the colony requeen itself, go through that whole process, and in a month they will start back on a road to getting stronger. But if we're proactive, we can requeen them. And so we can take a colony that's going nowhere, that's a dink, and as soon as we put a mated queen with precaution in some sort of a cage, and put her into the colony and get rid of the old queen, we can make them queen right within a week. 1 week versus 1 month. No brainer. As proactive beekeepers, we ought to be requeening rather than allowing the bees to do the job. We can feed them those munchies to make them stronger. Good supplemental feed. Just the liquid, just the carbohydrate, just the sugar or honey, if we prefer. We'll get them stronger. But we can also come along with a protein. There are some beautiful commercial products that are now available. A pollen trap is only a few extra bucks. Put a pollen trap on one of your stronger colonies, trap a little bit of pollen, and take those commercial products and pepper them like we would pepper our steak on a grill. Pepper them with real pollen, and you'll do your bees a lot of good. And then we should combine and unite weaker units. In commercial beekeeping, what they do is they keep a lot of these resource colonies. They are nukes. They're basically nukes. But resource colonies, they typically run colonies on a pallet. So 4 colonies on a pallet. And they want all 4 colonies to mirror each other. So colonies that are stronger, they'll take brood from and give it to a colony that is weaker. And those that are really struggling because of one of these issues that we've talked about, they will just combine it with a nuke. So they have a new queen in the nuke. They have some fresh brood. They have some honey. So it's a resource colony. So if you're running 1,000 colonies, you may have 100 resource nukes, 100 nukes that you're also running, because that's your resource. When you need to replace that colony on that pallet because it's going to pollination next week, that's what you do. You combine it with one of these nukes. And it makes a lot of sense for us in the backyard. Instead of starting with one colony, I have for years talked about being a 2.5 colony beekeeper. 2 colonies that you want to do your pollination, to do your honey production, do whatever you want. And then your resource hot colony, your resource nuke, often taken as a divide from your strong colony. When do you need the resource? Do you need it because it's gone queenless, or you accidentally killed the queen, or you need it to be ready next week for the anticipated nectar flow? Do you need it because you got to cull a couple of those ugly looking frames, and so you need a couple more good frames? Do you need a frame of honey right away? Well, go to your resource nuke. So resource nukes, that half colony, is that thinking ahead, that planning ahead, that anticipation. Good beekeepers, those that we might define as successful or are having a lot more fun with their bees, are beekeepers that anticipate rather than react to what we see. And keeping a resource nuke is a fantastic way to do that. Now, further north, during those seasons, they move further southward. And of course, a number of beekeepers like to come to coastal areas because they need their bees in February, March in the almonds. And there's just, no resources in the north. So they'll move colonies there, and instead of moving them into the valley, they'll look along coastal California because there are resources. You have resources that are available that are not others. And I know that creates some issues because Colin, our large beekeeper with thousands of colonies coming into you with you trying to maintain your own bees in California, it always creates some issues. It creates issues on the other end when they're in their home yards up in the Dakotas or Montana, and you want to move, you or other beekeepers want to move there to take advantage there. So it's conflict between the stay-at-homers and the commercials, the migratories are just are legendary, are ancient. Or take your chances. Again, if you've got 3 colonies, law of averages, one of them will produce enough honey for you. If you only need a few jars, some honey to give away to relatives, some honey to put up some fruit at the end of the season, some honey to sweeten your homemade Kahlua, your coffee liqueurs, or whatever you're making with them. A law of averages, one of the 3 colonies will produce something. So if the other 2 are weaker, yeah, okay, I can, I'll have more fun. Weaker colonies are an awful lot more fun to manage than those strong, big busters. Awful lot easier to go to. You can have all the fun you want in weaker colonies, where the stronger colonies, they may have fun with you. They may run you out the door, back into the house, and back into the easy chair. And of course, all too common, we hear beekeepers say, "Shoo, I'm not going to do mite control. I got to learn all these things. I got to buy this. I got to buy that. I got to buy chemicals. I don't want to buy chemicals. What the hell? If they die, I'll just get new colonies." So that's my cost of doing business, the cost of new colonies. It's a sign of the times. They buy colonies to save them, they kill them, and buy new ones to save them even more the next year. And this goes on for a few years until they discover their next best thing is way. Maybe they're having better luck with chickens, or perhaps the fox and skunks are getting most of their chickens, and after a few years they're out of bees, out of chickens, and so they're just into their gardens, whatever might be the case. Got a lot of beekeepers like that. I would dare say none at all in your club, but in other clubs I've heard of this happening, that they have those type of beekeepers. Probably not in your club, right? All right. if you haven't looked at any of the Ian Stepler blogs, I recommend them. He's up in Manitoba, which means nothing at all to you in coastal California in the Oakland area. But gee, they're fun to look at. He's got a lot of nice ideas. Um, so I've taken a screenshot from him. So here he's actually, this is an April shot. So he's strengthening he's adding a second box to a single box that he overwinters with. But I use it as an image here for uniting. Um, so one of the ways we can strengthen that weak colony is making nukes as a resource hive. If you've got you're adding the white box on top of the brown box, two strong colonies. The weak one ought to be the one up on top. If for whatever reason you favor one of those queens, you think one is the better one, kill the other queen. Go in and actually kill her. And that's something that many beekeepers don't want to do. And I dare say even the commercial beekeepers, they'll go ahead and replace a queen, put her in a queen cage, and say, well, I'll find a use for her. I don't want her in this colony. She's not doing anything, but maybe I'll find a use for her. So put her in the cab of the truck, and then she suffocates. So Mother Nature gets rid of her the slow way versus as we should do it if we're doing it correctly, just squash her right on the scene. Okay. But uniting the two, if we feed or we heavily smoke or we add a spray of a scented sugar syrup, we'll have a lot more luck. Get those bees wet if it's not too cold. Get those bees, wet them right down with a scented syrup on both sides, on both boxes. They're going to be so happy that they're getting that syrup off themselves, and everyone smells alike. We're all using the same deodorant. In this case, everyone, at that dance smells the same. Not sweaty, but certain perfume or underarm, and we're a lot happier. And bees are the same as well. Do it with newspaper between, make a few slots. The weaker one on top. Obviously, one of the rules that we've got to go by, that is the colony we're uniting and the one we're uniting to ought to have to be disease free. We don't want to bring disease from one unit to another one. And as early as we can to let the bees organize. Now I know you've had a lot of traffic just recently on that uniting, so I'm not going to go any further. I don't know if any of those people are on now tonight. Have had some great responses to the uniting on your site. Anyone have a response to any of uniting? Anyone you want to go any further with that topic? You've had some great responses on your site.
I know I brought up Stepler's technique using the queen excluder and the newspaper and the scented syrup, and Stepler seemed to claim, and he showed, which I found was very interesting. He would put a weak hive that maybe had like a frame or two of brood, like something really having some issues, and doing this excluder separation thing, and then coming back a week later and just assisting that queen in some way, and then she responds by building out really aggressive, vigorously, and shows her stuff. So, which I found to be kind of impressive. That he, it wasn't so much that he was allowed. It seemed as though maybe he's making the decision, like, okay, if she's really going to show her stuff and she just needs some help, he wins because now he's got two stronger colonies, and for some reason the other colony just needed a boost from some extra workers. Like it wasn't able to maintain heat well because it was small from coming out of winter. Anyway, so it was really useful. But yeah, I mean, the response that I got when I posted it was pretty great. It was really very helpful.
I have a specific.
Go ahead.
I have a specific question.
Sure.
For the sugar syrup that you spray them with, how much sugar, how weak should it be, and what kind of scents are safe to add?
You don't want to drown them. So just a weak syrup, just so it's if you tasted it would be a very weak syrup, less than Jarritos, less than the amount of sugar in a Jarrito jar, for example. which is mostly just sugar, of course, with a little bit of flavoring. But anyway, and I could say like in a Coke, and there's something like what 16 cubes of sugar in a bottle of Coke. So nothing that quite that strong. And just odor, agitate it. The oil won't mix with the water. So the essential oil that you put in, mint, lemongrass, whatever you want to use, just agitate it. So break up those oil bubbles. Just kind of distribute them among the syrup, and just spray the hell out of them. Just get everyone wet so it's almost dripping. And they're going to be busy. They're going to be busy the next few hours. And like I say, by that time they all figure out they all belong because they all smell the same. They all smell this damn peppermint. Where the hell did that come from? We haven't seen a mint field in bloom, but you sprayed it on them. So, you know, try different concentrations. You don't need much essential oil, very little, and you don't need a concentrated syrup at all. And you're feeding them water besides, which is always good. Back to the Stepler comment. You know why that works? So he favors the single brood box, and those boxes. If you saw that video, that box was pretty well packed. So putting the dink up on top, it's a relief actually for the bottom. What happens are the nurses go up above, and then he comes back in, well, I think, about a week, and then he sees, did that improve the queen? Did her morale change? Was it a turnaround, or is she still just a weak queen? So he's using that as both a pressure release for all those darn nurses down below, and then see if it can jumpstart that queen up above, and then he can pull them back off again, or leave it, or pull the queen out and reuse her somewhere else. So you've got lots of options. But I too, I like that technique. But part of the key is having the strong box below.
Right.
Remember, don't combine week to week.
No.
You combine two weak boxes, and you have one colony of two boxes that are still weak.
Yeah, it turned out that I'm kind of in that situation where I have like a very, very strong, very, very strong colony this time of year, and I have one that, because of, I'm calling it operator error, is on the dink side, on the small side, and I had remembered this technique and from watching his videos. I thought, you know what, maybe I'll give him give it a try just to see what happens. At the very least, I mean, but the other options, of course, were breaking it down and putting it into a smaller nuke situation, and feeding them and heavily and seeing what happens that way. But I'm just really curious to see how it goes. So
yeah, for sure.
I haven't made up my mind yet what I want to do with the poor thing, but I mean, I went in there. She's a nice big fat queen, and she's roaming around and laying. But I think at this point, it's so small that they're just having a hard time, keeping it warm. Even though we're getting some warm days, we had that dreadful smoke event. I don't know if you guys had it up there.
Oh, did we ever?
And we had days in which the bees never left the hive entirely.
Yep.
It was so dark, and we had that red shift, and they just weren't. It was infrared. Like we lived in infrared for a couple of days, and so
very strange sky, wasn't it? Very strange.
Yeah. So yeah, and so I think that may have impacted. It may have been on the verge anyway, and may have impacted their ability to to forage, and so I don't know what the issues were, but so anyway, it'd be fun.
It did. It all has to do with their orientation. So bees need to know where the sun is, because that's their orientation. Polarized light, not looking at the sun, but the polarized light pattern.
Right.
And that smoke just totally interferes with it.
It was amazing, because I would that the entire day there were this massive cluster of bees on all the entrances of all the hives, just sitting there.
Yeah.
Unable to figure out what the heck to do next.
Yeah.
It was
sort of like us, should I go out in that? Can I breathe if I go out in that? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I was confined for a week because I do have a bit of a breathing issue. So I was confined for a week here. So you've had this good discussion of some of the things that we could do with our weak colonies. I will point out, I don't know if you can see over my shoulder, That's our artwork for this year's NAPSI convention. NAPSI is based in San Francisco. Access their website by P2, Pollinator Protection. There's a lot of marvelous things on that Pollinator Protection. Well, their annual conference is next week. And so where am I going on this? We are recognizing Ian and as our individual that's related to pollination this year. So he's being recognized on an international basis. And I might say that with this issue of bees in national forests, and I don't, and you know, I'm sure within the group you have people on both sides, but one of the great things that NAPSI has done is not allow the distinction to occur between the wild bee pollinators, the feral bees, the native bees, and honeybees. Whereas there are some people that would like to drive a wedge between those two to protect the native pollinators. We've got to limit or reduce somehow the livestock of the honeybees. So we owe a real debt of gratitude for NAPSI for making sure the discussion on protection of pollinators includes and does not exclude us as beekeepers. They've done a beautiful job with that. And I'm involved in both Health Coalition and in NAPSI. You'll find on NAPSI a BMD program that we have been slow to roll out, but I've been involved in trying to do that. So you could, with a series of questions, be able to hopefully figure out what some of the issues might be in your colonies by going on the BMD. And that's hosted on our P2 website. Boy, did I take a side there. Okay. Stronger colonies. Stronger colonies, we're really then got to look at just these three issues most times. Mites, munchies, and over the winter period, moisture that's in the colony. How do we know strong colonies versus weak colonies? Well, that in part is experience, but we'll manage the stronger colonies differently. Or not manage them because they're too darn strong to go in, just kind of intimidating. You know, no fun to try to, you know, go in one of those that really, you know what they're doing and have to do some things, where it's a lot more fun to play with these weaker colonies. But stronger colonies too need some of our attention. Stronger colonies are those in which we're going to harvest honey from, whether we do it naturally as shown on left. And every time I show this picture on the right, people always ask, you know, is that petroleum honey that they're extracting? Look at the jar down bottom, at the bottom where that's coming out of the honey extractor. That is black honey. No, it's not motor oil. It's not petroleum. Jerry's looking in closely. I can see you're getting a good look at it here, Jerry. That's honey. And that's unfortunately the honey we get in the tropics. So this is actually a tropical picture. This is from, I go part of the year to Bolivia where I keep Africanized honeybees. Up here, I try to keep less defensive bees for half of the year, more Italian-like bees here. But that's a tropical honey. And the first one that the 3M is mites. And so I want to just make a quick comment about sampling. Sampling both before and after we do a treatment, or what we call pre-treatment and post-treatment, gives us a number. We can do a good sample. For example, we can use sugar shake, sample roughly 300 bees. Doesn't really matter where we take the bees. Many of you know and follow Randy Oliver, and he suggested that we would do a lot better taking the bees from the frame that's the side of the brood area, as long as you don't have too many drones and you get a lot of drones in that sample. And of course, recommending that we put the bees in some sort of an open container, not collect them directly into the jar, so that the older bees fly off. And we're biasing our sample in favor of the bees that are more likely to have mites on it, but we're after a number, a mighty small number at that, so that's a good way to try to work it. most recently he's looked in it, and it doesn't necessarily relate to how much you actually shake the bees. It's how we get that sugar distributed among all of the bees, so that all of them get covered with bees, and that's what's causing the mites to release. Alcohol wash is more reliable. This type of a container, two containers with a piece of PVC in between and the screen in between. Up where my index finger is, that's where the bee sample is up above. The liquid, whether it's alcohol, whether it's window washer fluid. Randy likes, what is it? It's not dial. He likes um,
Dawn.
high
Dawn.
sudsing. Dawn, correct. Yes, Dawn detergent. Low sudsing, grease cutting. That seems to be effective. And the difference in the alcohol wash, you don't shake, you actually swirl, so you don't get a bubble bath that's occurring in your sampling if you use something like Dawn or the window washer fluid. I only mention that because it's been hard to get. So those give us reliable numbers. After we've treated, if we go in a week later and put a screen bottom board in or use our screen bottom board and put in a sticky board or debris board with a sticky surface on it, we can count the mites. That's a good way to see if we had good control or not. I use sticky boards not to count every last mite. I have counted for years those damn mites, gone blind counting them, I think, and but rather an estimate. I look at the sticky board and gee, I don't see any mites here. Gee, this is good. Well, maybe there's one, maybe there's another one versus, oh, I'm getting about a dozen a day. I put it in for a day and I've got maybe a dozen mites here versus you pull out that sticky board and there are mites everywhere. So sort of a three-step, level evaluation. Virtually no mites, about a dozen, one a day, dropping one every other hour. 12 a day, dropping. Versus the third, lots of mites. And so using the sticky board, the debris board is a way to really check up and see if it worked. Because we're looking at mighty small numbers. We're looking at trying to keep the mite number below 2 to 5%. I think Jerry mentioned as a commercial beekeeper, 2% is way too high, half of that, never wanting to see really get above 1%, never letting the mites get going. At 5%, we have a higher risk of losing the colony to a virus infection. But 1 to 2%, generally keeping it below that, will generally be okay. The bees will keep mites. We're helping the bees keep mites in control, and that keeps the virus in control. And again, pre and post. But if you're sampling throughout the year, you recognize that after you've treated, most of us will want to treat after we take honey off if we're really trying to produce honey or keep our bees healthy. And then that next, after that treatment, we put in the sticky board. That's also a post we put it in as a post treatment, but it's also a pre-treatment estimate for whether we need to do it again with a different material or done a different way, for example, what we might be using and how we might be using it. So effectively in terms of treating. But when I ask that on my survey, and we do on a Bee Informed survey, what we get is that the vast majority of beekeepers sample by looking for mites on bees. Or when they got drone brood, they'll sample within the drone brood to see if it's got mites on it. And so I from the data from Sam Ramsey, who just spoke with your group, I think it was last month or the month, last month, I guess it was.
Last month.
Last month. He wasn't talking specifically about this, but to recap, he actually looked and found and tried to measure and measured where the bees are. He found that bees are left-handed. It's been confirmed they're lefties, because about 60% of the mites are on the left side of the bee on the abdomen. That's this red dot over here. Another 20% are, I'm sorry, come on. Another 20% are, because I'm touching my space bar to try to show you this, is another 20% are over here on the right side. So 60 versus 20, they're definitely lefties. Most of the mites are on the left side. And by looking at bees as we see them, that middle illustration there, we're looking at roughly 5% of the population of mites that might be on adult bees. I mean, talk about imprecise measurement. We're looking at the possibility of at most maybe 5% of the mites by looking at adult bees. And I equate that to, so you go to a lineup of some people, line up, sign of the times, lining up for food or for those coveted tickets into sporting things, etc. And you want to make a sample of tattoos. How many people in that line have tattoos? So you're standing as the line is progressing and you're counting. Well, there's one I see. Someone has a tattoo on their bald head. Jerry, do you have one? I'm looking closely. I don't think you got a tattoo on that bald head there. No, okay. So we wouldn't count Jerry. He'd go through the line, no tattoos. But that great big American eagle that he's got plastered across his back, we wouldn't see it all. So I mean, how effective would I? There we go. There we go. How effective would we be at sampling tattoos? Well, same with mites. If we're looking visually on the adults, maybe as much as 5% of the possible ones we can see by looking at them. Okay. Of course, if we actually want to look at them, we got to pick the bees up by their wings. And, one time, and I don't know if your club had it in a summer meeting, we would have a bee picking contest. Have you ever been to a bee picking contest? So a bunch of the members of the club line up, and we try to get the beginners there, and they stand in front of an entrance, and at the signal, okay, everyone pick up as many bees as you can that are coming in the entrance. If you get stung, you're out. Okay. And so the same thing, you pick up bees by their wings, you're not going to count very many, but make sure you look on the left side because they're lefties, not righties. Okay. So with mites, we want to, this term has become so common in our lingo these days, flatten the curve. And in medical terms, that means a normal bell-shaped curve that we see for pests that are introduced, for pathogens. In this case, it's new to our population. You see a bell-shaped curve, and so that's this pinkish curve here. And the concept to flatten the curve was to take the same number of people that eventually will be affected with the virus and spread them out over time, so that at any one time, the numbers that are infected don't exceed carrying capacity, in this case, our ability of healthcare facilities to take care of them. Well, we have been flattening the curve with our bees all along. Let me start. And so what does the mite curve look like? It is also a bell-shaped curve. It comes up a little bit in the month of May. This is a trace nationally. So the line is the trace of these several years process. The blue bars are the year 2019. The total N here is 721, and these are people that are controlling mites. So these are individuals. These are the a program of where individuals are actually sending in mites every month for 6 months. It's a program of the Be Informed, and they're actually then washing them and getting the mite number off of them. So the blue bars were the year 2019, but the trace of the black line was throughout the years. And you can see that it's U-shaped. It peaks in October. So this is across the country. There are no cooperators, I don't believe, in this in California. There are a couple in Oregon, but most of them are on the East Coast. So
Why
these
is
are people
November,
controlling mites, what we're looking at here.
why
So there
is
is,
November error bar so large?
Yeah, because they're across in many different areas, and we see the same damn thing in our colonies. We got a colony that's doing just well; their numbers are okay, and all of a sudden, whoa, where'd all those mites come from? And so that is reflecting the error bar so large because some colonies have a huge number of mites and others don't.
Robbing.
It's a way to horizontally transfer the mites, but can that all be robbing?
We often notice in August and September and October that a colony that has been plugging along just fine suddenly discovers robbing, and the mite numbers explode because they're robbing weak and poorly managed, unmanaged colonies.
Yep. And the concept that we call about mite bombs. So one colony gets the virus and crashes rapidly, but other bees come in to clean up. And in so doing, bring back mites, bring back honey, but also with a little surprise of mites. Yep.
Eric Musin a couple of years ago said that a bee can transport as many as a dozen mites from one place to another that way.
Yep. Yep. But can that explain the whole thing? I've got a different explanation, as you can see where I'm going with this. I mean, that is true. I mean, those are documented horizontal transmissions. They established a colony with very high mite numbers and marked bees in Maryland, and then went 3-mile radius from there and looked where the mites went. The marked bees went from the colony that had high mite numbers. Indeed, they found colonies around that had high mite numbers. The closer colonies in the same apiary obviously had more of the marked bees from the high mite colonies, but neighboring colonies in different apiaries also had numbers as well. So yes, that occurs. But I think there's another explanation. And by November, what is kind of different from colonies, let's say 2 months earlier, September? What's different in a November colony in much of the U.S. than a September colony? What's the big difference?
The populations are decreasing.
Population decreasing of adults.
Right.
And what else is decreasing in
Less
population?
brood.
The brood. So that large increase, in part, I think, is because mites are so intent in terms of their reproduction that 60 or more % of the mites are reproducing in brood cells when we're making those samples in September and into October. But come November, in many colonies, there's virtually no brood. So where are all the mites? On the adults.
Right.
Well, how are we sampling? We're sampling adults.
Right.
Yeah, but
that's a sampling effect.
That's not so true in the Bay Area. November, even December is more like October.
Yes, you are correct, and that is also true for Florida and Arizona, and you don't get as dramatic an increase or decrease in brood, for example, and so your numbers in terms of the mites are not as dramatic, and so that sudden variation, I think you will see more frequently as you're robbing, and those mite bombs. But I think for across the U.S. where this is done, I think that variation is, and the reason their numbers are high is really illustrating that of a sampling bias or the way that we sample for mites. But I absolutely agree with you. The coastal Bay Area is very different beekeeping than the rest of the U.S. And even somewhat different from Rose's book. I mean, he talks about this being effective all the way up here to us in Southern Oregon, but it's really, he's talking, Santa Barbara south to San Diego, really, with his beekeeping in Southern California. You're much closer there than you are to most of the books written in the Eastern U.S. So you probably should use that more as your Bible.
Yeah, the other huge difference is that it's urban here. So the flowering patterns are really urban, and
Correct.
you've got all the gardens and all the water. It's
Correct.
very different than Jeremy Rose's book.
Yes. And so what else is happening in the urban environment as well in this time frame in October, November? What else is happening? All those people that started to save the bees,
Right. They're giving up.
they're giving up. That's when their colonies are collapsing, aren't they?
Right.
And so they're weak colonies, collapsing colonies. And any smart bee, the short route to riches and fame, or at least riches, is to go and steal it from your neighbor if they can't protect it. You get the high octane stuff. You get the real honey. You don't get the dilute nectar. Yeah. So yes, that would be very much a factor in urban areas. Good point. So you guys are in an area where everything is very different. So we've been doing flattening the curve for forever for bees. For example, we want this is from my Honeybee Health Coalition. And because it was throughout the US, I came up with the concept, instead of spring, fall, summer, and fall, I came up with population increase, population peak, population decrease, and then, for the lack of a better term, the period that's not very, resource poor. They don't go into a dormancy, but it's resource poor. And so they're staying inside, staying home. So in flattening the curve, if we're after bees being very populous in a colony and a nectar flow available, we don't want to flatten that curve. We want the bees to grow exponentially through as much of the spring as we can to get just as many bees in that colony as we can, 40 to 50,000, because we're going to do better with that colony. So the bee curve we don't want to flatten, except for those that want to go into a queen event. We do want to flatten that curve for those that keep our bees from swarming. We want to do that skillfully, and so this is where we make our divisions. And so the anticipatory reaction here, the proactive beekeeper, is we keep that curve going until we really have to flatten it a little bit so it doesn't swarm on us, the colony doesn't swarm on us. And so we can do this skillfully by taking a frame or two out, splitting the population, demarrying, doing any number of things that are very, very labor intensive to keep it from swarming. So we're sort of flattening the curve a bit, but we're still trying to reach a good population. In contrast, the orange trace here, our mite curve, we want to flatten that curve. And if you recall what I showed with that mite curve from National, this is May. This is May right here. This is when we really got to attack that curve, because if we don't, that curve is going to then reach its peak in October, September, October, and at a time when there are less bees available, and this is when we're going to get that epidemic. Some of you are familiar with the model that Randy Oliver has developed, and I think that shows it very well, that if you start attacking this curve here in August, September, you are late in many colonies, particularly where there's this horizontal transmission, lots of backyard beekeepers, et cetera. We've got to, in our own colonies, get on that curve back in May, before the supers go on, or as the supers go on. We've got to use those chemicals that can be effective. The commercial beekeepers attack that all the way back before those bees go into almonds. They have to start flattening that mite curve. If they're going to keep this number at 1-2%, they're not going to allow this to happen. And so as soon as the bees start putting some weight on, some expansion, they're going to use a chemical to flatten that curve. We can use some other non-chemical means to help flatten that curve in May. Brood breaks, trapping mites in drone brood, for example. Good non-chemical means to do it. They're more labor intensive. Most of the commercials don't have the time to do those, so they're going to rely on a chemical here. They're going to have a chemical in during super time, if they're doing that at all, and then they get very aggressive at this fall time to try to keep that curve from ever getting to any number at all. basically commercials have half the loss of hobbyists. You saw those curves that I showed earlier. Basically, their loss is about half that of hobbyists because they're proactive. They start attacking that curve and understanding, the concept of flattening the growth curve of mites in this case. Now, for us in our backyards in the Oakland area, we can look in terms of trying to integrate against the pest of Varroa a number of management techniques. And we've come up a number of years ago with this concept of a triangle, where we can have a broad base of things that we can do that will help flattening the curve. Not sometimes individually very effective, but we can multiply them up by adding more than one. To the concept that as their numbers start getting larger, we've got to go to a little bit more better warfare against the pest. We come with traps of some sort, physical means, heat or cold. If we have a biological control that we can throw into the mix. And then as their numbers start growing exponentially or reaching a peak, we go with some sort of chemical control. There's a couple triangles up here because we can perhaps come with the idea of an organic, a chemical control that is a little bit safer, gentler, but still effective, versus the nuclear bomb where we're coming often with a synthetic. So in terms of looking at mites, flattening the curve, and cultural control, our stock. What kind of queen stock do we have in our colony? What are we using? Site selection. For the mechanical, drone removal, screen bottom boards, splitting. For the chemical, that we don't have a biocontrol yet that's effective. Lots of talk about some that might work. Parasitic mites, other mites don't work well. Nematodes aren't working well. Perhaps the fungi perfecti is going to come up with this fungus that'll work. So we jump to the sort of an organic chemical, an organic approach where we're using essential oil or formic acid in terms of our control. Versus in October, when we get that transmission horizontally, we get the robbing and our numbers get out of control. We've got to go to the one synthetic that works these days, the Apivar, or up our oil and our acids. Now you notice I have a comment on there because there's, you get a visitor every year that can talk much more better about the off-label oxalic acid. We really need something during that time when colonies are large that will really effectively keep the pressure on flattening the curve. Presently, we have only formic acid and HopGuard. HopGuard really only works well when there's no brood, and formic acid is a queen killer, and so have some real issues. It would be fantastic if Randy eventually, and he's almost alone in this, will come up with a way that we can have oxalic acid to fit into this particular window of time when the mites then build up so rapidly, and starting in July and into August, when most of us don't have very many other tools. The tools of the organic treatments don't work often for us because it's just too damn hot. They off gas. They are toxic in a short time when we apply them. So we don't have real good tools. But we've got to find a better way, which is the work of Randy, is, as I say, almost single-handedly looking at ways to try to make oxalic more effective. However, through most of my life, I've had an extension appointment, so I'm not permitted to talk about these off-label. I've got to talk about what's on label. So you didn't hear any of that from me, but go to Randy to get that information. That's what I mean by that. So, finally, back to Ian. Let me finish up. There's a question on that, comment?
No, I think the problem is that some people who should be muting have not remembered to mute themselves.
Okay, not a problem. I'm about finished, so we can maybe have some discussion.
I just muted him.
Okay, thank you. Moisture, and moisture, cold is not going to kill our bees. It's always moisture. And this applies to whether you're in the Bay Area or it applies to whether you're in Manitoba where Ian is, okay? Moisture is going to kill the bees. It's not cold. Bees do very well with the cold. Yeah, we could have a better hive to get through the coldest parts of the U.S., but we can do that by adding some more R factors. We can put some insulation around the outside. But most of the heat loss is actually through the top. And the issue with moisture is that bees in their cluster warm the air, and warmer air holds more moisture. And that warmer air eventually leaves their cluster and rises. That's what warm air does. And so it comes up to the covers on our colony and can condense. And it can condense as droplets, and the weather warm up a little bit, and it rains droplets of water back onto the bees. That's the moisture that I'm talking about. That's the moisture we've got to control better. It's not the cold that's going to kill colonies, no matter how far north you go. And Ian is doing that by this reflective of what he calls reflexx, reflectix, a silver blanket that he keeps on top of his colonies. As I indicate, he's a one-star colony for a good part of the year, one box beekeeper for a good part of the year, as a winter blanket. And what it does is it allows that moisture to be able to be then shunted to the side from the top, and then recirculated back down along the sides of the colony, rather than the droplets forming and raining down on bees. And then, as you can see, about in the middle of where he's pulled this back, he has a hole in that material, and through that hole is how they are then going to get above. And an excellent above is a candy board. Make sugar into a solid rock candy, and if you are a favorite of a solid rock candy, root beer barrels are one of my favorites. Okay, you can't chew those things; you break your teeth right away. And so what you do is you put it in your mouth and you suck it, and you give some more liquid to it. Well, same too with the sugar candy on top of the colony. So the moisture coming through that hole that he's cut there forms a slurry, and then the bees can slurp up the sugar. They can't actually eat sugar. They don't have the right mouth parts. They can't grab a hold of sugar crystals, but they can come up through that hole and get the sugar candy. And that's an emergency feed, so that if we're a little concerned we don't have enough, that's a good emergency feed. So one of the things that for Bay Area beekeepers, instead of worrying how much feed is on the colony, just make up a sugar candy. Put that sugar candy on top of colonies and let the warm moisture of the bees on those cool nights come up and make a slurry out of that candy. And it will serve then as an emergency feed through the type of winters that you have. It's easy speasy. It's try to have at least a couple of frames of honey. Uh, in your case, you don't actually have to have it above the bees. Although most of us try to keep bees in a couple boxes, and the top box being our feed box where most of that honey is. But the outer frames, you can overwinter a 5-frame nuke as long as your outer 2 frames are pretty much full of honey starting the winter. It's also a way that he can add the dry protein. But we're finding that also very effectively, if you buy the powder protein, the dry powder, and put it out, keep it from getting wet when rains eventually come. Hopefully they'll come. But when they do eventually come, whatever amount of rain we get, so it doesn't get moist, doesn't get wet from the rain. A good container I've seen is people will buy a 4 to 6 inch PVC pipe, buy the plug, put the plug on one end, cut a piece of, a couple feet, something like that, of this PVC pipe, put the plug on one end, fill it in with powdered sugar, cut the end that the bees are going to go in at a bit of an angle, and it's a dry pollen feeder. And, that'll take the place of, the days that they can't get out to your eucalyptus if you're, over on the slope in Oakland or wherever you have your bees. And that protein will kind of keep them going for the winter period. And then once weather improves and they start getting all those spring flowers and they start their upward curve, you can take those protein feeders down, or in most cases they'll be empty. So instead of making the patties, go ahead and feed the dry protein and the sugar candy, and you've got all in most cases your colonies will need for emergency feed to get them through the winter.
That's a feeder you place in your yard rather
So
than.
you place it in yard, just put it on posts or hang it from something. Not so it's blowing in a breeze. They're going to get a little nervous if if it blows in a breeze. But many cases people just go ahead and mount it on a post and just place it somewhere in the yard. Tell your neighbors that you also are raising birds as well as the bees, and they probably are already nervous about all those white boxes that you have anyway. So put some pieces of white PVC around there, and they'll be absolutely convinced that you've totally lost it. And I'm going to stay away from that neighbor.
I have a question on the hard candy.
Yes, a hard candy.
We have huge ant problems here, and I'm just wondering how you would, or whether there might be a problem with this slurry in the winter with the ants invading the hive and then harassing the bees.
Generally, no. The ants are going to be in up above the top. What you've got to look at is the top of the colony. Somehow modify your topping the way you have tops and not let the bees get in. No. But what many people will do then above that is underneath the cover, we'll go ahead and put a piece of foam insulation. You'll find the ants will nest right in that foam insulation. So you got to be a little bit careful. Yeah, you kind of got to keep ahead of the ants. I have terrific problems of ants in Bolivia. When Africanized bees encounter the ants down there, they abscond on me. They just abandon their whole colony. That's not great for my honey production when they keep abandoning the damn colonies. So I have to keep my colonies on stands that are continually treated with a grease or an oil. And you'll find, with our ants, which are not nearly as aggressive as those in the tropics, that'll do the same thing. And not let them get going with a nest in the top, whether it's the foam material or whether it's within the inner cover on top. Try to get the ants, there's always a ground contact, so break that ground to hive contact and you won't have an ant problem. Hopefully. The ants will find a way around. Okay. What else we got? Oh, we're back to a commercial again. So a few comments about some of the things we might do now. I know it's getting a little bit late, but I'll stay as long as you have any questions. So I guess we'll throw it open for questions. Maybe if you can unmute yourself, or is there anything in the chat at all that's come in, Jim?
Jolene asked a question earlier. Did she get her question answered, or would she like to ask it now?
About the scents?
Before that, I think.
Oh, about removing the, if we saw a diseased pupa, if we happen to remove them, would that be helping or hurting?
Yeah, it's like the bees. There are a lot of them. And so it's hard for us to go ahead and try to remove them individually. With American foul brood, it doesn't work at all. If you see odd looking pupae in cells, sometimes those infections will start on a frame. So if you got brood on 5 frames and you see one frame that all of a sudden is showing some of this, get that one frame out and then continue monitoring. And sometimes that's enough. Just getting that one frame out is enough. But individual cells, no. So think of it as a frame-wide effort that you've got to have to do. Okay. I thought maybe I'd go ahead and get out of my screen here and then we can look at each other.
Any other questions from anyone?
How come I'm not going back to full screen? Oh, I gotta get out of my share, don't I?
Yeah, I could ask a question about chalk brood, reasons for chalk brood, and how to help the bees deal with it.
Moisture generally is one of the issues that we'll see with chalk brood. So kind of looking at moisture control might help in terms of trying to bring that back. Some colonies are just susceptible. We think, genetically just susceptible. So if you're seeing a lot of it, try feeding. Try seeing what you're doing with moisture control. Is that water raining back down on the bees, or have you done something about moisture control? And if it just is very heavy where you hardly see it in any other colonies, our solution is to try a different stock. So mark that colony and then plan to buy a queen, or later in the season, let that colony raise another queen. Actually go in and kill the queen, raise a new queen, and hopefully her offspring or the stock that you buy will not have that susceptibility to chalk brood. So try some of the easy things first. Try the moisture issue. If that doesn't work, try the hard thing. Go ahead and try to see if you can replace the stock. Not right at that point. They, like European foul brood, it's a stress disease. Feeding them helps them get through stress a little bit better. Using your resource hive, you unite something else to them so they're stronger. Maybe there's an imbalance in the population, so the nurse bees are not taking care of of that moisture in the brood nest. You don't have enough nurse bees, so sometimes uniting them, that's a perfect place to put the resource hive to use that half hive. But if you don't have it, unite it with another colony, see if you can reduce the amount of harm that it causes. And again, if it's just very heavy, think about queen replacement. Make any sense?
Yes. Also, so if it's showing up in several hives in an apiary, and the moisture seems to be, it seems like is it contagious?
Great question. We don't think there's much horizontal transmission of the disease, no. So it's conditions that are in that apiary that are affecting more than one colony. Try feeding a syrup or feed dry sugar. Try attacking the feeding aspect of it. I mean, if it's really hitting all the colonies and really holding them back, it's not genetic, quite, I don't believe in hitting all of them. So it's something about that site
Brennan?
that might make a difference. Try feeding the protein too. So it's again, stress. So if you supplement both those, the carbohydrate and the protein, maybe you'll get them through that stressful period and into a better shape, better time. And particularly look at how the bees are handling moisture within the colony.
I started a few years back, started using quilt boxes, especially once winter starts to set in here. I mean, it's damp. I mean, if it actually rains, it's like continuously wet. I mean, it's just hideous. In my neck of the woods, I live in El Cerrito, which is cold and windy and damp most of the year, but in particular in the winter. But I was having an enormous problem with water, with damp on the inside of the hives, and I started using quilt boxes, and it really was improved the internal conditions just a little bit. Like it was just acting as a way of wicking moisture out and then absorbing it. And that seemed to help. In my case, anyway, it helped an awful lot. I'm hearing a lot of folks up in Washington and coastal Oregon, coastal Washington are using them as well. And do you know much about that up there?
Heavy use of quilt boxes up here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and we don't get that heavy cold winter, but we get that same moisture that you experience for a little bit. We get a lot of that. It started raining here this weekend, and it won't stop now. So let me tell you about moisture at our colonies here. Now, the silver that insulation, the silver insulation. The nice thing with a quilt box is it brings that moisture in up above, holds it there, and then you have screening or holes or something so that it then wicks it out of over time out of the top. So yeah, we've got a lot of people that really like some sort of a quilt box.
Yeah. One winter, I think the worst winter, went into it, and there was like mold and fungus everywhere, and it was literally, I mean, the combs themselves were just like just sopping wet. And then after that, I just started using quilt boxes here, and it just took care of it completely. We get this prevailing wind, so there's constantly the box I've got of these screen holes on it, so I have it so that there's always a bit of a breeze passing through the quilt boxes, just drawing the moisture out of the straw or the wood shavings and so forth in there, keeping it nice and dry. And it's really helped. Really helped.
Yeah. And really, OCD people will go out and they'll put something like burlap in that quilt box.
Yeah.
Or towels. Will go out. They'll take the wet towel out and put a dry one in. Fluff the towel up, give them a chocolate on it, of course, like the nice hotels will do. Bring it back in, dry it in a dryer, and then it's ready for the next time. I mean, that's a little bit over the top, but I mean, you love your bees. Some people love their bees, and
yeah, it's just and I think that's such a huge problem here in the Bay Area of trying to help each other out with the conditions and the problems that they're having as beekeepers. And inevitably the question is, well, where do you live? What's your neighborhood like? And there's just so much variability here over the course of a year with the kind of weather people get. Like I remember early this spring, I was talking to Jim how we felt like we were having a heat wave because it got to 65 here one day. And Jim was like, well, it was 93 down in Sonoma. I mean, the range of temperature and the range of rain and moisture and wind and so forth here it can drive people crazy. So for new beekeepers, anybody here tonight, it's just like, pay attention to what your local climate is like, and adjust accordingly. Because
I think all beekeeping is local. And for your association, you've got some real particular challenges because local 5 miles away is can be very different from where you are.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, Marin County, just across the other side of the bay doesn't have nearly any of that. Gilroy, that group, the Mount Diablo group, doesn't have nearly the range that your group is faced with. So you gave perfectly good advice how to do it for your apiary.
Yeah, they call it microclimates.
Yeah. The microclimates.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any other questions for Dr. Caron? This is odd not having this group say something.
Jim, you're in your garage, are you? It looks like you're
I am.
Garage.
This is my my office as well. I work from home as well. So this is my office.
Jim is our professional beekeeper in the club. He has several hundred hives and almonds.
Yeah.
Catherine Edwards is also a semi-professional beekeeper. She keeps a number of hives in the Bay Area.
Well, people have gone to extremes to try to make their office be somewhere different from where the rest of the family is. Jim went right out to the garage. He's got the right idea.
On the other side of the ranch, I have another office, but when I'm at home, this is
yeah.
Getting back to the alternative oxalic acid treatments. There's some talk with some people about almost using that year round. that you use almost a slow release of oxalic acid in the hives almost continuously to keep the mites like at a lowish level almost 12 months a year, or particularly during the growing season. So it's kind of interesting that some of this rather than sort of hitting it at certain times, because a lot of beekeepers here seem to get that they're doing this reactive beekeeping where like they get a high mite count and then they nail them with mite away quick strips and so forth, and then it just seems as like there's much more. There's been talk now of using oxalic acid on cardboard strips or dish towels and so forth, and just keeping them at a level all year round. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out with people.
It will be versus a flash treatment, and there are valid opinions and evidence on both sides.
Yeah.
The one thing I'll say without getting a nasty note back from Randy about all of this is that I and many others are terribly concerned about putting in a chemical to kill the pest that stays in the system or is repeatedly used in the system for a long period of time.
Yeah.
In other words, resistance.
Rotate treatments, yes.
I said something about IPM. Of course, the people come back and say, well, the bees are never going to, mites are never going to develop resistance against oxalic acid. We've got to figure out first how it's killing. I mean, is it strictly through their foot pads, or is it other ways? And don't count upon the pests of never say never, that they're not going to be able to develop a resistance to that. I mean, they'll simply change the way that they cover those foot pads, and then if that's the only that's the most effective method of getting oxalic into their system, the oxalic isn't going to work anymore. Then we'll up the amount of oxalic and we'll go through that same treadmill, and pretty soon, no matter how much oxalic we throw at them, it doesn't kill them.
Just a note on that. I've been using the pads for I think I started in June, and might test this week. Most of them are doing very well. I'm at under 2%, but I had some outliers that were at 7%. So I switched over to Amitraz treatment. Just because I don't know why. I have no idea, but I'm concerned about resistance, so I switched treatments.
Jim, you brought up an excellent thing. Amitraz has been around for a long time, and our beekeepers have used it. I mean, they were using it back when they stopped using fluvalinate. So it's not just been since fluvalinate, since camouflage. Their beekeepers have been using it a long time. And a number of those beekeepers are starting to report the same thing, outliers. I did the same thing, and why didn't it work in this one? Treatment failure. And we're wondering if that's not the beginning of the end with Amitraz, because we are seeing that when we do the experiments, as for example, Oregon State has been doing that. We go into those same colonies and we use the approved treatment because we can't go ahead where you can get the pesticide license to use the non-approved, and we don't find as many of these treatment failures, but we do still find some. And the USDA in the study, last one that they did with their poll line, the same thing. They found these outliers, exactly what you said, Jim. Of is it treatment failure? Is it my placement? I did something wrong. Is it that the bees just didn't get to it? I mean, with the Apivar, the Amitraz, if you put those strips, if you're using the Apivar formulation, and put them in where you want brood, which you should do, if the bees move away from that and stop rearing brood on that frame, so they're not much longer on that frame, you may well get treatment failure because they're just not being exposed because they're not walking on the strip.
In my case, it was actually the oxalic pads, Randy's oxalic pads that failed. I have some failure on, which which was interesting. That's why I
The
switched over to
Swedish
that.
towels, the new material,
Swedish
or
towel.
both? You use
Yeah.
both, yeah.
So that was just interesting. So I switched
Yeah.
over to
Yeah.
an amatraz treatment just to switch it
Yes,
up. a little
clean
bit.
them up. Yeah.
Bars are on
Yeah.
the floor.
I'm sorry.
Top of the bars are on the floor.
Top bars. It's too difficult for me to get between the frames.
Yeah. Yeah. The top part. The nice thing that he's reporting with that delivery is that and he points it out, there's a huge difference in surface area.
Yeah.
And that may be the key of why that might be a better medium than shop towels, or why the hop guard might be so irregular in its effect, because those are just cardboard strips that go down between. Yeah.
Hey, Dewey, before we go, thinking about proactive treatments that people read and watched some stuff about the Welsh, I think it was the Welsh beekeepers, and that they were doing, and it was recommended by the agriculture ministries in Great Britain to do annual shakeouts, complete shakeouts of their bees onto fresh frame and fresh foundation as a proactive treatment for things like chalk brood and European foul brood and other stuff. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, it seems like it can be kind of expensive to do that, obviously, replacing entire frames and foundation, but they seem to think that if you get an artificial brood break by doing a shakeout, because you're removing all the brood that's in there, but you're putting the entire existing population, including the queen, back into a fresh environment. And so you get a brood break, so you get a mite break, and then you get fresh foundation and fresh frames for them to start rebuilding fresh comb on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A couple. That old wax is a sink, and so pesticides, pathogens, that's where the European foul brood pathogen comes from. It comes from those, it's been buried in the broods in those cells somewhere, and that's where. So the pathogen is always there. So the new wax would help get rid of that. The second is, we asked questions on the Bee Informed survey about replacement culling. How heavy do you cull? And those that cull heavier, not necessarily a full break, but replacing 6 or more frames in a box every year, their colonies don't do as well. They have heavier winter losses, as measured by winter losses, not by production. And it's that other thing, George, that you mentioned, and that is, it's a terrible resource issue of having to eat so much of the nectar to be able and extra of the bee bread to be able to kick all those wax glands into being secreting the wax. So the most valuable resource we have in that colony is not the box, it's not our brain, it's the beeswax comb itself. And so I think as a a compromise, the practice of culling the worst of the worst every year, 2 or 3 frames. If you have 2 boxes, getting the worst frames into the lower box, and so before they start turning things around in your case in January, then there's nothing left in those. If there was any brood when you put them in the lower box, that would have hatched. Getting them in the lower box and then getting them out of the lower box by replacing frames. Now you're going to replace them with foundation frames. And so in January, early February, you can put those foundation frames right in the top box, right in the middle of the top box. Now, this presupposes that you've got boxes of equal size. And of course, many of us like to have a standard on the bottom, even commercial standard, than a half depth. And they like it for transport because a 1.5 weight-wise is less than 2. Jim, how do you run your commercials? You 1, 2, or 1?
I run all deeps, everything.
All
I have.
deeps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's because I can interchange the frames that will.
Exactly. And so there's real value in that. And as I say, you get those dinks, those frames with a lot of drone comb, those really dark ones, get them in the bottom box. And then before things get rolling in the spring, remove them from the bottom box when they're empty. They're empty of, they might have some leftover pollen in them, but it's nothing the colony's going to suffer from. They'll use up the honey. There won't be any brood in them. Or get them to the very outside, but I really like to get them in the bottom if you have 2 deeps. Many of our Oregon people run 1.5. And we'll reverse. Do you practice a lot of reversing or none? Reverse the position of the boxes.
There's a lot of people who do 1.5s here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you reverse, Jim?
I do not. I do not.
Okay.
I try to.
Sometimes we're reversing because queens don't want to, go up or something. So you just switch the box around. She'll go down, but she won't go up.
She's reluctant to go down, and we actually reverse so that we put her down so that she'll go up into the next box. And if there's a lot of honey in that top box, she won't go up because there's honey in the way. And so rather than reversing, what you can do is remove some frames in the middle, 2 or 3 frames, and make it a triangle. So brood in the middle, new fresh comb, either foundation or empty drawn comb in the middle in the top. So rather than the whole reversing, you make sure you have a triangle, most of the brood in the bottom, but expanding into the top. So if you have 2 deeps and it's just too heavy to lift that deep and switch the positions, you can just move some frames around and do the same thing. And for those of us that with poor backs and harder to lift those boxes, that's a good way. If you don't have very many colonies, just move frames rather than moving boxes.
Yeah, I actually will move wherever the queen is. I want her on the bottom. So
you want her on the bottom.
Right.
Yep.
So that if I need to, I will reverse a box.
Yeah.
If that's what you're talking about, yeah, I definitely do that.
I don't know what it is about our climate, but and the bees obviously are not reading the books, but you see in the standard books that there's this honey cap with pollen in between and brood in the middle. But we typically have frames that are wall-to-wall brood, end-to-end brood, maybe a little bit of a corner of honey on each end of the frame. But you can pretty much interchange those bottom to top without having to pay attention to leaving a honey in the middle, for instance, if you're switching boxes around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What you want to try to sort of keep is still keep that edge frame that has so much of that bee bread. Keep that sort of still on the edge.
How many of those should you keep? I'm kind of recommending that people can probably manage with 1 pollen frame per brood box, because I think 2 or 3 or 4 gets in the way of the queen laying eggs. Yeah, I agree. And we have bees bringing in pollen 12 months of the year, and they're bringing in too much.
You are pollen rich, yes.
Yeah. And they never use it up in the winter like a temperate climate colony would.
Because there's fresh stuff coming in so soon in the spring. Yep.
Eucalyptus in the winter.
Yep.
Tons of pollen.
Of pollen.
I had that situation here this year where take a typical frame, and it was about 30 to 40% pollen on the bottom and just a little area left over on each frame for them to raise brood and then honey. It was just excessive. It was like wall to wall in the colonies. There was just so much. Well, we didn't get rain. It was kind of an interesting situation. Normally we get, the big flow starts here in like February, everything is in bloom, but we didn't get rain all month of February. So everything was in bloom. There was so much pollen, so much nectar for them to bring in from city fruit trees everywhere. It was crazy. And it's still going on. They're bringing in pollen all day
your
long.
Cat's tail is trying to get in for some of this.
This FaceTime. Get her into a bee suit.
There you go. She wants some FaceTime. It wants some FaceTime.
Yep.
You're right. Yeah, yeah, and that's an issue. One possible way of trying to handle that is to go ahead and move some of those over into the nukes. And the nukes will use that up at a faster rate than, let's say, the established colony. Just because you make a nuke doesn't mean that you have to keep it as a nuke. So those can become resource hives for you. The problem is in the backyard, we've got 3, 4, 5 colonies already, and our neighbors see more boxes growing in that backyard, and they get awful, mighty nervous. You know.
That's good. Yeah, good idea.
Any other questions for Dr. Carroll? Caron?
Thank you.
So
Well,
wait,
have a good fall. I hope you get the rains. This storm passed you and it hit us. By the way, if you need some rain in February, give me a call. I'll send buckets of it down to you guys.
We just might.
Once it starts raining here, it doesn't stop. Although I'm smart as a beekeeper. I leave this, so I go to Bolivia and play with Africanized bees. Their border is closed right now, and I can't go now this winter. But
so how are they to deal with?
Variable. Small colonies are a delight, but boy, once they start putting a little bit of resource in there, and they start filling out that box, the one day they're nice to work with, and the next day they're a monster. I have to continually harvest the outer frames from. I keep them in one box. I continually have to harvest those outer frames because otherwise, they'll say, "I'm done. That's it," or well, we're going to leave. We're going to abscond. And so, you gotta every week I'm in pulling outer frames out. It's not a great harvest. Some of them are pretty light. I don't have that system that the Chinese have for taking that light honey and doing the evaporation process and calling it honey afterwards. I think I need one of those systems, but we sell at drugstores, and the people don't mind if it's they don't want the thicker stuff. They do really want to kind of have it diluted because they're putting it in their eyes, they're putting it in their ears, well, putting it everywhere basically. And they want to help the medicine go down. So they're not putting honey on toast or in tea. They're using the honey as a medicine. And I put a lot of stuff in with it. So I put some royal jelly in with it. Even if I don't, sometimes I use that label. I put pollen back in with it. And I mix propolis in with it too. The propolis is very thick. So if you got some light honey, you mix it with the propolis, boy, it goes, it's a nice mixture. And people swear if you got a cold coming on, a sniffle or something, propolis drops on your tongue, and that's the next best thing. Our honey and lemon up here, cough drops or whatever.
So what do you do with the how do you have to process it anyway?
I do. So it's an organic. So you process it in the real good stuff, the stuff that they grow in the countryside, the pure alcohol. Process in that. It's about a I don't like to heat it because I think it changes the propolis. My propolis, by the way, is eucalyptus. Mm-hmm. They've done the same thing there as they have here. They planted a lot of eucalyptus. It's a marvelous source for trapping pollen, let me tell you. And it's a good pollen that the bees like, particularly the blue, not so much the red, but the blue gums, the blue eucalyptus. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful pollen. Very few people seem to have a reaction to that propolis. To that propolis. And it's about 7 months. So I'll trap that in November. Down there, and I'll have it on about 3 colonies, and I trap enough pollen in about a month's period of time to last me the year. I'm sorry, not trap pollen. I've trapped pollen as well, but it's also a marvelous source for the propolis. So I don't use the plastic screen. What I use is I have supers, boxes, in which I'll pull. I've got the end pieces cut so they meet in the middle with a line. And what I'll do is I'll pull them out and create like a finger worth of space, like a gap, a air draft. They don't like that. They'll fill that right in with propolis. And in the good colonies, I can then pull it again. And so I'll get 2 fingers of just rolls of propolis, pure propolis, the depth of that box. And I'll do that with 3 or 4 colonies. And often I'll do that on the colonies that I'm trapping pollen on too. And it doesn't get contaminated. It's not contaminated propolis. It's pretty pure, just the propolis that they're collecting from the eucalyptus.
And then you thin it with an alcohol. What type of
with alcohol. So it soaks in alcohol.
What type of alcohol do you use?
I'm sorry.
What type
Everclear.
of alcohol?
So I'm using the grain alcohol, the pure stuff. Yeah.
It turns out that the Everclear that you can buy in Oregon is 95%, but the Everclear you can buy in California and Nevada is like 60%. State laws differ.
Yeah. So on your next trip to Oregon, come buy out our.
There we
Evergreen.
go. Get the
Yeah,
good
the pure stuff. In a pinch, you can use some vodka. Not this.
Actually, the 151 proof rum, if you can find it.
Or the 151 rum. Yeah.
Well,
That's
Dewey, I
75%.
hope next time we see you, you give us a presentation on Bolivian beekeeping. I'm
That would be awesome.
fascinated now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ronnie. Yeah, I'll have to do that.
Better yet, sponsor a little tour. I bet you can get a 50-person tour group going down to watch.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I did that. So I led about a half a dozen tours, and when I'll go to different meetings, I still meet some people that were on those tours, and it was always fond memories because we would take them into some nasty bees, but most of the bees were really not very nasty, and into some unusual circumstances, sometimes planned and sometimes not planned, but. So it was I did most of that in Panama and Costa Rica. I tried to do one in Bolivia. And so we were going to go up to Arenal, an active volcano, and we were going to sit there in the hot tubs and watch the volcano throw off its sparks. It's lovely, once it gets dark. So we arrive at the hotel, and other guests had come earlier in the day. They had real money, and so our reservations just evaporated because there was another group there. So I got a whole busload of beekeepers. We may do, but it's in Bolivia. Mañana is the way they plan. So if someone comes in with cash, that's mañana. They've got cash. They're not going to wait for the person with the reservation to show up. And we've had buses canceled on us for the same thing. Someone else came by and needed a bus right away. But believe it or not, in both Panama and Costa Rica, I could do those reservations, rely that they would be there, and the bus would be there, and the bus would be clean, the rooms would be clean. That's all relative, of course, clean. And both of them, we could spend one day at the beaches looking at the turtles and the turtle nesting, et cetera. And so we could have these diversions. And both of the countries, you can get to different habitats very quickly.
Yeah.
In Bolivia, it's everyone's dying of gasping for breath because we start at 8,600 feet up in Cochabamba. Yeah. I don't dare take them to La Paz at 12,000 because everyone would need an oxygen tank. But
I don't know. Sounds like fun to me.
There were a couple that I'd like to forget about that were the one in Bolivia where nothing seemed to go right, but when it went right, we had a lot of fun. We really did. Beekeepers are the craziest damn group you can ever imagine, and they know how to take something from nothing and create some fun out of it. So, and they're so personable. So, I mean, just listening all day to someone tell the story, and then the next day, of course, the same stories with a slightly different ending or something. Yeah. So I've done that, Ronnie, but I've gotten that,
Pass the torch.
Yeah, and I've done that with students too.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a whole different group. They march to different drums, I
Yep.
think, or I don't know what's going on. And of course, in both countries, Mary Jane is very easy to get, so the university students love to come down to Costa Rica and Panama and spend a whole semester there in a
Yeah.
cloud.
Sure. Sure.
All right. Well,
All righty, Jim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
absolutely appreciate it. That was
Sure.
incredible
Thanks
presentation.
so much. It was so great to have you.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks.
All righty. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Right. All right. Take care, everybody.
Okay, bye, Jim.
Bye, Jim.